Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's MLA Goat Roadshow webinar. Our topic for tonight is on-farm biosecurity, and we have a diverse lineup of 5 speakers for tonight's webinar, attending from all across multiple states to give you an overview of on-farm biosecurity for the Australian goat industry. If you have any questions during this evening's webinar, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we ask that you answer your questions in there for each speaker, and we'll either address them during the webinar or towards the end of the webinar session as our live Q&A session at the end. My name's Dr. Melanie Smith, and I'm the MLA Program Manager for Sheep and Goat Productivity, and I'll be helping to facilitate tonight's webinar. Our first speaker is Elizabeth Bradley from Integrity Systems Company. Elizabeth is the Manager for Quality, Policy and Compliance at Integrity Systems Company, also known as ISC. She's responsible for enhancing the compliance of the LPA programs and oversees the LPA audit program. Elizabeth also manages the NLIS Identification Device Accreditation Program and works closely with industry and government to implement required changes to LPA and NLIS. Please welcome Elizabeth.
Thanks, Melanie, and hi, everyone. Yeah, so as mentioned, I do work for ISC, and we look at LPA and NLIS. In particular, we provide the NLIS database for everyone to use. So LPA and NLIS work together to provide assurance for the red meat industry in relation to food safety, animal welfare, traceability and biosecurity. Together we call both NLIS and LPA the integrity system for the red meat industry, which is where we get our name from in terms of Integrity Systems Company. So firstly, with LPA, being accredited allows you to use the LPA National Vendor Declarations, or the NVDs, which are especially important if you're selling into export markets. Following the LPA standards actually means you can back up the declarations that you make on those NVDs, so it's really important that you follow along the standards when you're in the program. On the other hand, of the equation, we have the NLIS, which is actually a legislative requirement, which is enforced by each state and territory. And that requires you to identify your livestock and record their movements in the NLIS database, which enables that traceability to happen. So the use of the National Vendor Declarations, or the NVDs, in conjunction with your livestock recording in the NLIS database is really, really important, because in the event of a disease outbreak or a food safety incident, we need to be able to trace those livestock back to where they've come from, and that's really important. So producers accredited under LPA need to use those LPA NVDs when moving livestock off your property, and you also need to record those movements in the NLIS database, usually within 2 days of that movement actually occurring. The LPA NVD can actually be recorded in the NLIS database against that movement as well, which further supports traceability as we move livestock through the supply chain. Being able to trace livestock is really critical for biosecurity in particular, especially if we do have an emergency animal disease outbreak, because we need to find the infected animals or potentially exposed animals, and so we can try and prevent that from spreading even further. So yeah, importantly, meeting LPA and NLIS is really important to protect our industry and your livelihoods as livestock producers. Now we're going to just talk quickly about biosecurity within LPA itself. So there's a requirement in LPA to have a biosecurity plan in place, which covers how you manage and minimise risks around biosecurity on your property. So this is around diseases, weeds, and pests, and knowing what to do if there is an issue, and remaining vigilant with all your monitoring and your practical applications of what you're doing on farm. I will point out that in some states in Australia, having a biosecurity management plan is also required if there was an issue and livestock needed to be destroyed, so that you could access insurance money. And in some states, if you have visitors coming onto your property as well, that can actually go away to help with prosecutions. In LPA, however, biosecurity plans can be audited as part of the LPA program. So it's really important to have one in place and review it at least annually or as your enterprise changes. Biosecurity plans can be any type of where you want to have one in LPA, so digital or paper-based. You can use templates from other programs even, or the LPA template is available for free to use as well. Biosecurity plans in LPA need to consider things like people, livestock and equipment coming onto your property, as well as how you're monitoring for diseases and pests and weeds, and knowing your local contact details for your vet, animal health officers, the emergency animal disease hotline, and also just practical things that you should be doing around getting health declarations for incoming livestock if you're bringing them onto your property, and fencing, signage and training staff where it's applicable to you. Now, it can sound a little bit overwhelming, but we do have lots of resources available for you. We have done a suite of previous webinars and videos around biosecurity plans and how to complete them, as well as we have our templates, an LPA learning module on biosecurity specifically, and we do have a load of resources on the NLIS, which is a little bit of a pain point sometimes, about how to use the system, and of course we have our email and our customer help service that will be able to help you if you need any help around the NLIS database as well. That's it for me for now, so Melanie, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. That's a great overview of what ISC are doing in regards to on-farm biosecurity and traceability. And Elizabeth will be joining us on our Q&A session at the end of the webinar as well. So I do encourage you, if you do have any questions relating, please put them in the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. Next up, we have Dr. Rob Barwell from Animal Health Australia. Rob is a veterinarian who's worked in Australia, England, and Hong Kong before joining the Animal Health Australia team in 2012. Rob manages the livestock biosecurity and animal health projects with a focus on endemic diseases at AHA. He's passionate about working with AHA's members to make positive change in animal health and welfare on farm, which will really benefit Australia's livestock industry. So please welcome Rob to have a bit of a chat to you today about on-farm goat biosecurity and the Goat Map program. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, MLA, for having me on the webinar this evening. Just a really quick intro for those that might not know who Animal Health Australia or AHA is. We're a not-for-profit member-based organisation with 34 members, which includes all the state, territory and Commonwealth governments, as well as most of the livestock industry bodies, including the Goat Industry Council of Australia. Our vision is a national biosecurity system that provides every opportunity for Australian agriculture to succeed. So I'm going to give a very high level sort of overview of biosecurity on farm this evening. My fellow speakers will certainly give some more detail around some of the on the ground or farm level biosecurity measures, etc. So at its core, on-farm biosecurity is risk analysis and practical measures to address the risks on a farm. Essentially keeping things out, keeping things in, minimising them and making sure something doesn't happen. Okay, so how can good biosecurity benefit you? It's about managing risk, as I said, so pre-farm gate assessments to support decision making and prevent a problem from coming onto your property in the first place. Ongoing surveillance monitoring, ensuring disease is detected quickly and acted upon. Increased productivity through endemic disease management should lead to increased profitability on your farm. And the ability to demonstrate your on-farm practices to purchasers of livestock and their product. So why have a biosecurity plan? It reduces the risk of pests, weeds, and disease incursion on your property. Implementing practices outlined in your plan results in an immediate and ongoing return on the investment that you'll make in that biosecurity. Quicker recovery and losses will be minimised if a disease event does occur. As Elizabeth just mentioned, there are requirements under certain Q&A programs like livestock production assurance to have a biosecurity plan in place. And also, she also mentioned some states have introduced additional regulations to address potential biosecurity risks of unauthorised entry to places where animals are kept if a biosecurity management plan is in place. So what are the steps towards developing or preparing an on-farm biosecurity plan? So every farm is different, and you really need to tailor the biosecurity plan to your property and to your herd. So first step is to determine what you want to achieve through implementing a biosecurity plan. What is your goal? Assess your risks. What are the likelihood and consequences of a pest disease and weed incursion to your herd or property? Capture the things that you might already be doing to minimize those risks in your plan. And then create an action plan to prioritize improvements to your on-farm biosecurity. Most importantly, action the action plan. Don't just let it sit in a desk drawer and be rarely looked at. And then, of course, like all good plans, you need to review it at least annually. Where can you find biosecurity information, including plans? Elizabeth obviously pointed towards the Integrity Systems Company resources. There is another website, which I'm sure many of you would have come across or heard of, the Farm Biosecurity website, which is a one-stop shop for all things biosecurity related. It has a number of different types of planning documents on there, including the action planner, which is a more generic and simple sort of biosecurity plan. There are species-specific biosecurity plans, manuals, and videos of biosecurity all on the website. Other sources of biosecurity information would be your relevant state and territory Department of Ag or Department of Primary Industries website, and livestock production assurance as just mentioned. So under the biosecurity plan, what are the sorts of things that we break this down into? So a good biosecurity plan should have a map with all the relevant infrastructure and entries and exit points on it, as well as the inclusion of what we call the 6 essentials or principles of biosecurity. So we've broken it down, I guess, into its simplest form of inputs, people, vehicles and equipment, production practices, pests and weeds, outputs, and then training, planning and recording. Now, I'm just going to focus very quickly on the first few due to the limited time I've got this evening, but they're all important. So by far the most common way of disease being brought onto a property is with introduced animals, whether purchased or on agistment. So buy animals from trusted sources and ideally with a national goat health declaration. Animal health declarations are available for sheep, cattle and goats. Know their history and ask more questions beyond the health declaration if you need more information. When the stock come on or the goat animals come on, make sure you implement isolation periods. A couple of days for them to empty out and for weed seeds maybe to pass before quarantining them away from the main herd for a period of up to 30 days while you monitor them. By doing this, you can stop those problems getting in the first place. The other inputs that you need to be thinking about are your feed sources in particular, because feed can be a source of things like weed seeds, and the type of feed. So particularly for ruminants, we have the ruminant feed ban and a requirement to not allow restricted animal material or RAM to be fed to ruminants. And water sources are obviously important as well as another input. Next, essentials, people, vehicles and equipment, probably the other way that things can get onto a property. So it's always important to alert visitors to the fact that you have a biosecurity plan in place for your property. In some states now, they do also require you to reference the particular legislation for that state. So be mindful of that in some states such as Queensland and New South Wales. Implement entry and exit procedures for visitors coming to the property, particularly those that are going to be dealing with your animals. and my fellow speakers will talk a little bit more about that. Restricting access of people, vehicles and equipment to production areas of your property. And assessing the visitors and machinery before they come on, particularly with visitors. Have they had contact with other animals, and have they been overseas recently? Keep records of visitors, including the areas they have visited on your property. And minimise the lending of vehicles, machinery and equipment to others. And if they are, then make sure they're cleaned down before they return. Final essential that I'll touch on very quickly is production practices. So most importantly, it's about monitoring your animals regularly for unusual clinical signs. You'll be best placed to know when you're seeing something out of the norm. If you or your staff do see anything unusual, something that is suspicious, then please contact your local vet, animal health office, or the emergency animal disease hotline with the number at the bottom of the screen you can see there now. And using ag and vet chemicals and vaccinations according to their instructions, and maintain records of all products, including batch number, expiry, and the date that they were administered. Finally, just on the biosecurity plan, when to review it. As I previously mentioned, you should be doing it at least every 12 months, or when the risk environment changes for your property, when you change your your management practices, or when you just experience a disease pest, well, that should say, or weed outbreak on your property, not weed. So I've also been asked to touch on market assurance programs this evening. So the market assurance programs have been around for a couple of decades now for sheep, cattle, goats, and alpacas. The remaining ones are for sheep and goats, with alpacas and cattle having chosen to implement different systems of assurance. The maps aim to provide a source of low-risk replacement animals for those herds who want to avoid introducing JD and CAE infection into the herd, reducing the risk of JD and CAE being spread via shows and sales, and to maintain a reservoir of low-risk animals using management strategies that minimise the risk of introducing disease into the existing MAP herds. So Goat MAP, as I mentioned, has been around for quite a long time, but there was a significant review undertaken that was completed in 2020, and the decision was made by the Goat Industry Council of Australia to keep it in place, as well as include caprine arthritis encephalitis, CAE. So the original Goat MAP was split into Goat Bio and JD MAP modules. Goat Bio is the baseline biosecurity required before the disease modules can be completed, and they should complement other biosecurity programs such as livestock production assurance. So if you're doing biosecurity for livestock production assurance, as Elizabeth was talking about in her presentation before me, you are well placed to already be ticked off for the Goat Bio module under the Goat MAP program. The second module, JD MAP, picks up the other components of the original Johne's disease, or JD, part of the program. Statuses in that are monitored negative, 1, 2, or 3, and the year that the herd attains the status is also reported. Flocks maintain status by fecal or blood testing, or they can do so with vaccination with Gedare, which is the JD vaccine, which is mostly used by the sheep industry, but it is registered for goats. This then would mean that you have a V added to the status. You, as a herd owner, the main thing you'll need to do is to work with your veterinarian. Now, under the previous Goat MAP system, that needed to be a vet who was MAP approved. Under the new system, they no longer need to be MAP approved. There is the training there available for veterinarians to do. So for vets, the online training is still available. But you then set up an agreement between the vet and the client. Most importantly, the vet that you're working with will need to do an annual review with you for both biosecurity and then JD if it's this module, or the CAE map module, which is the new one. So the CAE map aims to identify, protect and promote herds at low risk of being infected with CAE. Is based on herd testing to detect the infection and property and herd biosecurity management that minimises the risk of introducing and spreading CAE in the herd. As I mentioned before, the goat bio module is required as the first step, and then herd owners can implement the CAE map with the veterinarian. Herd testing is used to assess the likelihood of infection being present in the herd. And this may be achieved by individual animal testing, by regular testing of bulk milk for dairy herds. So there are two testing pathways. The milk testing is a relatively new thing after research that was done by the Elizabeth McCarthy Agricultural Institute in New South Wales. A series of negative herd tests conducted at regular intervals is required for a herd to obtain and then retain the monitored negative status. And that's similar to the JD, but there's only an MN1 and 2, and the year of entering the program is also reported. So as a first step, for instance, the herd would be reported as CAE, MN1, and then the year of 2022 if it was last year. And sticking with my time limit, I'll just point to a couple of web pages, URLs, and there's a QR code on there which I think takes you to the Goat Map web page. So for all documentation related to the Goat Map, the modules, checklists, etc., please see the Goat Map web page on the Animal Health Australia website. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob, for that great presentation there. It's really good to get an overview of what AHA is doing within the goat industry space, and this was a great way to showcase those linkages to biosecurity and on-farm practices with Goat Map as well. Our next speaker that we have is Beck Brayley. Beck joined the Queensland Department of Agricultural and Fisheries during the equine influenza emergency response in 2007 and has been based in Charleville for the past 15 years. Beck recently moved from Biosecurity Queensland to take up a new small ruminant extension position with DAF Animal Science, which is really great for the goat industry to know that there's a new biosecurity and small ruminant extension specialist based out in the Charleville region. Charleville is an extensive grazing area, and most of Beck's goat experience to date has been with rangeland goat enterprises in southwest Queensland. As the rise of exclusion fencing has come in over the past 10 years, goats have definitely been increasingly put behind wire, and in her role, Beck has seen as a stock inspector more health and disease issues similar to what you would expect in sheep and cattle operations. So Beck is joining us today to provide a bit of a on-farm biosecurity tips and also as a bit of an introduction into hopefully what we will see as a familiar face around the goat industry. So please welcome Beck.
Thanks so much for having me, Melanie, and hopefully some of these people on tonight's webinar will follow up with me, and we'll be able to start really building a quality goat network in an extension network in Queensland. So I'm really looking forward to meeting you all offline after this. I'm just going to click through these little slides. I'm based in Charleville, which is Bidgera country, but I'm coming to you live from the big city of Brisbane tonight. So Rob's already spoken about biosecurity plans and why it's so important. And the reason why we bang on about it is because in the event of a biosecurity emergency, everything is easier to manage on the ground if we have some of these decisions made ahead of time when there is no pressure or stress. Some of this planning will help you in your day-to-day activities on the property, and some will hopefully never be needed, but it'll be there for an emergency response. If there is a biosecurity event at your property that your stock or your property become involved in, you can pull out a folder and have everything you need, or a lot of the things that you will need to answer questions at a time when you may be under considerable stress. Sometimes there is a legal requirement to do some of these things, like our previous speakers have spoken about. So there are some legal reasons why you've got to do this as well. But as a shortcut, Rob already mentioned it, but there are some really great templates online that will help you think about your enterprise, what risks you have on your property that you'll need to make plans for. But most importantly, find your local biosecurity officer or animal health specialist in your state. We've all got different title names, but ask them to review your biosecurity plan, especially if you have some unique biosecurity risks. Another thing that's really good to keep in mind if you're involved in organising an event, your event should have a biosecurity plan. The horse industry got very good at event biosecurity planning on the back of Hendra virus, and we can learn from their example. There's templates going around. You may even have a horse group in your community that's developed a biosecurity plan, and you might be able to borrow theirs and adapt it to goats and have specific things for goats. So biosecurity just isn't just about an emergency disease outbreak. We're also talking about day-to-day management. And one of the easiest ways to keep your animals healthy is to not import someone else's problem. Talk to your agent about your biosecurity priorities, request your National Goat Health Statement or your National Goat Health Declaration, find out more about the animals that you want to buy. If you want confirmation about a specific disease, and you'll hear an example of that tonight, ask for more information from the vendor and from their vet. And if they don't want to provide you that information, ask why. And then think, are they a potential risk to your business? Because it doesn't hurt to ask. And you may find out that it's a very simple way to avoid a much larger problem. So when new animals arrive, keep them separate, as Rob's spoken about. Use the opportunity to test for worms, to drench, vaccinate, observe for signs of illness, empty out potential weed seeds. The period of time is recommended to be up to 30 days to allow for testing times for common illnesses and treatments to be effective. Another one of our speakers tonight will be talking to you about that in more detail. And again, there's some really excellent free resources available on the Farm Biosecurity website. You can search by species to find all of the goat-specific resources that they have there to save you time. And if you plan your arrival quarantine properly and allow for adequate feed and facilities to hold them in, it'll make it a lot easier to do, and you're more likely to do it again in the future. I always say to people out west where I live and work, to choose an area where runoff is contained, so that weeds are contained in an area they're not going to wash into waterways and things like that. So you don't just want to be thinking about biosecurity that's on your property. You might want to be thinking about things that affect downstream neighbours. And also diseases can spread and wash out of areas and at different times as well. My other colleagues are going to be talking about some of these things in more detail tonight, so I won't talk too much about specific diseases. But what I will say is that you need to manage health and diseases with all species on your property in mind. So goats, sheep and cattle often share similar viruses and diseases. And so if you're managing them for one species, you should be considering that for all animals on your property. Dairy, fibre goats and stud goats are usually more intensively managed. They're more likely to be vaccinated and have detailed health histories available, but still ask the question, never assume they have a clean bill of health because they are well handled or from a stud. Don't ever assume, always ask the question. Rangeland goats out in my country often come through depots. They've got unknown origins, unknown health history. They can be boxed with mobs from other origins. We also don't know anything about those other mobs. They can be stressed by mustering, transport time in the depot, and then transport to destination. Stress can make them more susceptible to common diseases. Examples I've come across are loads where hundreds of goats have died in a delivery from enterotoxemia, which is also known as transit tetany, worms and salmonella. In these cases, no arrival quarantine was done and goats were jumped off trucks and bushed into large paddocks. where they couldn't be remustered. And treatment becomes very difficult in cases like this because mustering to treat the animals would have further stressed them and could make more of them sick. So, you know, if there had been an arrival quarantine consideration put in place, that problem could have been minimised. The next thing I would say is get to know your local vet. Ask them questions about diseases they've seen lately and ask them what might be unique to your area in the current season. Develop relationships with the animal health professionals in your area. And if you don't know who your biosecurity inspector or your government vet or your other biosecurity inspector equivalent is in your area, find out. They've got so much free information and it's their job to help you. You can actually use them to your advantage. In a lot of cases, they can do free diagnostic work for you as well. If your private vet's not sure about off-label prescribing for goats, because some private vets don't have a lot of experience with goats, particularly drenching, get in touch. We can help with that. There's also an excellent resource on the Parabos website, which has great resources for goats and management info for specific grazing and climate areas, and drench decision-making guides, which are great for when you get that egg count back and you're not sure if you should drench or you shouldn't drench. So Parabos has got some really good practical, usable info that you'll use time and again. So make the most of it. Visitors are a significant biosecurity consideration, no matter the size of your operation. There are a lot of examples of biosecurity incidents all around the world, spreading from one farm to the next by people who just didn't have a clue that they were even a potential risk. Truck drivers, staff, vets, neighbours borrowing machinery, on-farm hay sales, just to name a few. Some people, often vets, turn up in little petting zoos, or people have unofficial petting zoos on their farms. Those kind of visitors, that's a thing to keep in mind. All visitors pose different risks, and you can get free visitor register templates from those websites we've spoken about before, and you should use them. And before people arrive, when they're calling to, let you know they're coming. We don't often get drop-ins in our sort of part of the world. Usually people have got to go out of their way to get to properties in the country I work in. So there's usually a phone call that happens before that visit takes place. And get in the habit of asking them where they've come from. Have they been overseas recently? Are they bringing their own food with them? Ask your truck drivers, have you stopped anywhere else? Are you going to be stopping anywhere else before you come to my place? Ask your vet, are you going to any other properties today? Do the staff and contractors that work for you own goats or other livestock at home? And do you have a plan in place for visitors to come clean and go clean? Talk these things through with them before they arrive. These really simple things can reduce your risk significantly, and they take 5 minutes to ask. And it's a really simple thing to get in the habit of asking. In my experience working with quarantined properties, those who knew these answers, had those conversations and developed these habits, usually avoided bigger problems, or they were returned to normal business much quicker than properties who hadn't done these things. So I've got some special considerations for goat enterprises that have come about just in my time around the traps. Goats have some special considerations purely because of their versatility as a production animal or as a pet. They're highly appealing as pets, and they're charming characters, and they're chosen as a livestock pet for people living on small acreage quite often because they're just a great pet animal, and there's so many positives about them. As goat producers selling or giving goats to these smaller properties, there is a need to educate that person who's taking on the goat about goat management, and also informing them of their legal requirements of owning livestock animal in your state. I've heard of cases of people buying goats as pets and not having fences for them, not having PIC numbers, not having any idea about NVDs or ear tags or what to feed them. All of these things might seem small, but they pose a biosecurity risk to the commercial goat producers around them. And it's something I see often. People have them in town just as little lawnmowers and stuff. Those goats in town pose a risk to their commercial properties around them. So it's something that we really need to be aware of. One of the most common biosecurity risks I've seen in my time as an inspector, potty animals living in house yards and chook yards. Chook yards are often really well built, so they'll contain a goat. So it's a quick thing to just chuck them in there when you're driving, they're eating your roses or something. But there's a potential there for them to access RAM, which is restricted access material. And Australia has a ruminant feed ban to prevent the potential spread of transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. That's a big word for a group of diseases, of which mad cow disease is one of them. So the ruminant feed ban is there to ensure that our meat and meat products continue to have access to domestic and international markets. You'll see the labels on your chook food and things like that at the produce. That means things like dog food, chook pellets, pig pellets, all the things that potties may come across in a house yard are illegal for them to eat because they are ruminants. And you need to keep your goats in your house yards or chook yards. Oh, sorry, if you keep goats in your house or chook yards, you must keep your ram feeds in a separate location and prevent all ruminants from accessing them. This includes eggs. Using eggs in homemade colostrum brews for sick ruminants is a definite no-no. Unique risks I've come across out my way that could also apply to your property, tourists, and mostly what they do with their rubbish and their food scraps. You don't know where they've come from, if they're international visitors, what food they might have somehow got through quarantine, if they're taking every food scrap and piece of rubbish with them. Some people advertise and encourage campers in paddocks where their stock are grazing and they can literally walk up in and amongst caravans. Others try to discourage them, but there are camping apps that advertise free camps on public land like stock routes and unfenced roads, which are also grazed by stock. So those are some, we come across those kind of risks out. It's a really popular thing to do, to go camping, so keep that in mind. Another one I've come across was some people that did someone a favour and let them spell some stock on a long journey on their property. What diseases are coming in with those animals? Will this affect the animals on your property? Are you going to put them through your own yards, or do you have a separate loading ramp that you can unload and reload them somewhere else? Can you keep them in that quarantine paddock so you don't risk your own animals or your property? In one case, the person that was doing the favour had to be quarantined, and it was a significant economic impact on their property. A simple phone call to me as their local inspector could have avoided that situation altogether. So ask the questions. It really might save you a lot of headache. So I've got some take-home messages here. Don't import someone else's problem. Find your local biosecurity inspector. Develop a relationship with your vet. All your biosecurity plans are going to be different, and you can customize them depending on your geographical location, your climate. You may have a feedlot on your property. I don't come across many feedlots in Western Queensland, but we have drought feedlots from time to time. All of those things are different and unique to your enterprise. So customize it to you. Keep records. It will make forward and onward tracing and back tracing of movements so much easier if we know who's been in your property, on your property, and your visitors and contractors, things like that. And again, a reminder about RAM. Keep your ruminant pets and potties away from your chook pellets and your dog feeds. Do not use eggs or other restricted foods in any homemade remedies. And lastly, because old habits die hard, I'm not a biosecurity inspector anymore, but early detection of an emergency animal disease could make a huge difference to the outcome of an emergency response. So if you are ever in any doubt, call the Emergency Disease Watch hotline. It's monitored 24 hours a day, and there's also contacts there for all your local state government, agricultural departments. So you can screenshot that screen or go Google it later. But yes, if you ever need any help, I'd be happy to help and answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Beck, for that really insightful and practical approach to on-farm biosecurity in ways that producers can be aware of how they can implement practices on farm that's really going to save them if they ever were, hopefully not, but if they ever were faced with a biosecurity challenge. I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A chat function at the bottom of the screen. It's in the middle. Type your questions in there and we'll answer them as we go and towards the end of the webinar. Our next speaker today is Glenda Hendry. Glenda is an emerald goat producer who knows firsthand the importance of on-farm biosecurity. After an incursion of the Mycoplasma pneumonia illness last year, her property lost more than 300 does and kids over a 12-month period of time. Glenda is going to provide an insight into what steps producers could be taking to protect their herds and provide a bit of a case study of her own experience. So please welcome Glenda to present tonight.
Sorry, not very good at this,
All good.
but we'll be right. Okay, welcome everyone. I've actually, I'm part of Queensland Goat Producers Incorporated, and our Mycoplasma further encouraged our work with the Queensland Goat Producers. And right, in 2021, I actually purchased 3 little stud does from auction. We called the goats the fleas, which unfortunately became quite apt. These goats were placed in quarantine, but only for 14 days. They appeared healthy, and at that stage, we believed that 14 days was fine. We began kidding, and it was a really dry season. As you can see, from when they started kidding to when they were full into kidding, it was a dust bowl. I started to have all these strange little things happening. I thought it was pink eye, respiratory distress in some kids. I managed to nurse everything through. I really wasn't losing animals at that stage, but we did have issues. As those kids grew up, and I was speaking to another producer actually today who agreed she had exactly the same problem. It was when she actually, after weaning, that the kids actually were starting to die. And we had odd things like little weaner does were prolapsing, anal prolapse, and thinking, goodness, what's happening there? I managed to fix them and things, but I'm thinking perhaps it's an actual case of our feed regime, what was going on. And every time we opened up an animal, because if an animal dies, I want to know why. As a producer, I really need to know why an animal's dying. Yes, we actually had a number of autopsies, and I had local vets attend and everything. That Proteus exudate that I probably don't pronounce correctly actually was present in a lot of these animals, but even the vets at the time didn't actually know what was causing it. And we were suspecting the Ngura burr because we'd had a flush down the river. It was all dry. And we move forward. So in May 22, we actually did attend this, I actually coordinated the Springsure Goat Show. We had 188 goats from all over Queensland attack. attended that. 1 week later, we started kidding. The conditions changed here. We don't have wet winters. We actually have usually dry, mildish. Sometimes we can get cold, but you know, animals shelter out of the wind and they're fine. Then all of a sudden we had animals dying. I actually contacted everybody because I thought, goodness, you know, what is this? And nobody could tell me. You know, unfortunately, you know, we had a local vet that came out and told me it was pregnancy toxemia. That just wasn't correct. Anyway, after lots and lots of pathology and everything, we still had no answers. There were different things coming through, and I was constantly being told that I had a worm problem. I do actually test, and yes, I ended up having worm problems as they were dying. You know, as an animal gets compromised, every parasite starts to hit it. You can see the shelter that we have on the screen there. That, you know, that's usually just for kidding to keep them out of the cold winds. I looked through all my books and everything, and then actually 2 weeks, but it was manic time, as any of you who actually own, you know, are actual farmers know, you know, your animals are dying. I was out there every 2 hours, day and night, and the rest of the time I was completely, just manically looking for what was causing this. We were bearing ute loads of goats a day. Potty pen was overflowing, and thankfully Dr. Baxendale actually suggested I contacted Dr. Lloyd after I'd kept saying, I think we've got mycoplasma, and I didn't know enough. I was really scared that we actually had an exotic form of mycoplasma. Dr. Lloyd came to our farm in July 22. You know, that's what looks like a perfectly healthy animal. You know, my animals were all in really good condition, and this is what was happening. These does, whether they were in kid or had kidded, were going down like this. It was incredible. Dr. Lloyd actually managed, because she's a pathologist, managed to actually identify the mycoplasma really quickly for us. Now, goat owners have to understand it's a fragile bacteria, and it is transferred through respiratory tract by close contact. But in saying that, the actual the symptoms are just incredible with this thing. I've probably put down, that's every symptom we've had on the place. But you can probably add the anal prolapses and everything into this, because that was from them coughing, even though I didn't notice. And I monitor my animals quite intensely, really, for the amount of animals that we have. I walk through them on a daily basis if I can. So yeah, what did we do wrong? You know, I didn't get the 3 fleas tested. They looked to be perfectly healthy. How could I actually ask to be to have tests for something I didn't even know existed. And no one had diagnosed in the length of time that we'd actually been struggling with why are animals dying. And those kidding paddock shelters actually, with the rain and everything, turned into a hothouse for mycoplasma. But once again, you know, goats, as you all know, don't have, especially the kiddies, don't have much fat on them when they're born, and they actually, was I going to let them die from exposure or let them huddle under the shelters? Now, the positive thing is that I believe we're living with mycoplasma. We did recently actually take 2 animals to the Springshore show. A lot of people didn't attend because they were scared of the mycoplasma thing, but I had my animals cleared and they were separated from anything that could actually, you know, I would never risk other people's animals, and definitely never allow anyone else to go through what we've been through. So we constantly monitor our herd for any symptoms. Changes in conditions will cause outbreaks. I'd just spoken to someone today and was very proud we hadn't had a death for a month. We had a death today. The weather's changed and it's actually raining here tonight, which is horrific for us. But the animals with mycoplasma can actually be, you know, they can be treated, and very, very proud of the work that Dr. Lloyd's done with us, because we have an animal called 380, and she is the poster girl for mycoplasma. She walks like a crab, she's blind in one eye, and it's just that I spent 2 years nursing that damn goat that when Dr. Joan actually suggested that she should be euthanized, I said no, let's try everything we can, and she's actually clear. So, you know, it can be dealt with. We've been using the acid in the troughs, because if I had COVID and you had COVID and we shared a cup of coffee, it's very likely that we'd share COVID. And I sort of thought that would work with mycoplasma as well. Yeah, mycoplasma. Yeah, and it doesn't affect your animal. It doesn't affect sending animals to processing. It was suggested originally that I just send everything off and start afresh. We've got a lot of genetics that we don't want to lose, and yeah, we decided that we'd live with it. At the moment, I've got 7 does. They're actually with a buck. We're about to consider, but I'm actually, you know, especially with the change of weather and everything, I'm glad that we didn't actually, we hadn't joined animals this year. We're missing a whole year really. The bucks have been really actually, and I've noticed the male animals do seem to be a little bit more resilient, even in the weathers. A lot of them were more resilient. Most of the weathers have gone off the place because they went to the meatworks. And yeah, we're hoping to develop a herd immunity, survival of the fittest. And the crossbred animals are far more resilient. Yeah, and we're now running a closed herd policy, and if anything ever came on the place, it would be tested to the max. There is hope, and yeah, Our summary is quarantine all introduced animals for 1 month, as we've learnt, or as recommended by your vet. Build a good relationship with your vet, encourage their education in goat health and contact with experts. We actually don't have a goat vet in this region, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Joan now. Test all new animals for all diseases. When we first even started, we should have actually used, but we didn't know, the CA and JD, because it seems to be more focused into the actual dairy herds. I believe it should be more focused through all stud herds. We vaccinate all our animals and test for drench resistance, and maintaining good records. I struggle sometimes, everyone does. You know, because we're dealing with animals, we're dealing with life and death sometimes, and I've dropped the notebook in the trough, etc., as we all would have. But I pieced together the mystery as to where the source came from by going back through records and the different things that have been happening over the time. And yeah, we believe that, you know, educate all goat and sheep producers and animal health personnel about mycoplasma and goat health. There's more and more goats, and we get a lot of vet students here, and hopefully we can have more goat vets. There's been a lot of people in the last 2 years that have contacted me. And mycoplasma, I believe, is very, very common in Australia. I've spoken to people from all states of Australia, and in confidentiality, of course. And I've asked people, will you put your hand up too? Yeah, I understand why they don't want to, but we're running a stud. I had to, you know, and I didn't ever want anyone to go through what we've gone through. So that's hence I want this as public as possible. Don't give up. Investigate all deaths and communicate with your network. There's a lot of very knowledgeable people out there. And I've found goat people to be incredible because they're so supportive. The amount of different theories over that period that people came up with. Yeah, and we looked at every possibility. And more research needs to go into mycoplasma, I believe. Because there's been a couple of little incidents where I've actually questioned. And the 2 little goats down at the bottom in that photo actually were mycoplasma. One of the photos of the eyes back there, the blind eye, that's actually Big Girl, which is 580. So I had 380 and 580 that are both were mycoplasma queens. Tony is actually perfectly healthy now. He was crippled. His knees were just absolutely swollen. And yes, thank you very much. Yeah, and goats are good. But a compromised goat, yeah, actually will isolate itself, and they mask their poor health. So your powers of observation are invaluable in maintaining a healthy herd. Keep your biosecurity policy and knowledge updated. If we want the goat industry to progress, we need to support producers with everything, and unfortunately sometimes euthanasia is the only humane answer to the problems. And feel free to call me if you ever want to discuss anything, but don't give up. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Glenda, for sharing your case study on your biosecurity problems that that you experienced. It's a bit of a heartbreaking story to hear what you had to go through, and I really appreciate you taking the chance to express that with industry to make sure that others can learn from your experience, and hopefully they don't have to go through a similar set of circumstances. That leads us to our last speaker of the night. We have Dr. Berin Squires. Berin has a small boar goat herd in northwest Victoria, but is also very fortunate that as part of her veterinary role with Agriculture Victoria, she gets the chance to talk to and provide extension to vets and producers about their goats and their disease issues as well. So she's providing practical insight from someone who lives and breeds goats at home, but also in her veterinary role as well. So please welcome Berin to tonight's webinar.
Hi, I'm Berin Squire. I'm the Goat Health Veterinary Officer based in Victoria. Thank you, Melanie and MLA, for the opportunity to talk to goat producers Australia-wide tonight. If you don't mind, I'll actually turn my feed off because I'm hotspotting to my iPad at home and I don't want the system to glitch. So I'll talk. You'll see me in the Q&A when I'm not presenting. So what actually is biosecurity? It's this big word. It's not only a little word, security and bio, anything to do with biologicals. It became a buzzword probably 10, 15 years ago, but basically it's a set of management practices designed to reduce the risk of introducing something onto your farm. It protects your livestock, your farm, your industry, and you. And there's national strategies and on-farm practices, which we've all been talking about tonight. The example of the sign that I've got there is the biosecurity sign of what is now being included in Victoria, that visitors must gain consent to enter or remain in and interfere with or disturb any livestock or thing on the premises. Each state has introduced something to prevent unwanted visitors coming on. And if you've got that at your front gate, the main thing is to check that the phone number in the sign is current and legible. As unfortunately, with what the sun's like in Australia, the details can fade. I know personally as a vet, even if I've got an appointment with the farmer, if there's a sign at the gate, I still ring from the gate, as there may have been an incident on the farm, animals getting out, a chemical spill, or the producer may have had to go off farm and go to town for a part for the tractor or something like that, and may have forgotten to ring me to cancel the appointment. So what can you do to prepare? With your biosecurity plans, don't just do a ticker box thing. Really think about how you could practically implement a quarantine-like situation on your farm. Can you set up internal paddocks so you can feed stock away from the boundary fences in case your neighbour has a disease which you don't want your livestock to get? Do you have a second entrance you could use for deliveries? Could you set up a receival point for deliveries at your front gate rather than having people drive up to the sheds? Can you keep stock and the effluent off your internal farm roads so services that you do need can access your loading ramps, silos, or milking parlours without having to drive through manure or anything from your livestock? Understand what to look for in your goats. What are the clinical signs of disease? And how to seek advice. Early detection and early reporting is critical, and hopefully everybody's got that emergency animal disease hotline number in their phone. You can work with your vet on your biosecurity plan. I mean, it may be one way to develop the vet-client-patient relationship that's required to prescribe antibiotics and other veterinary medications. Have you got a digital thermometer in your goat toolkit? Knowing what is the normal temperature range of a goat can help with early intervention. I know most people have got mobile phones, but have you got the ability, and do you know how to send photos with their permission to your local vet or your local animal health officer to ask, is this something that I should be getting looked at? The EAD hotline in each state has a duty officer on call 24/7, and most states have a roster system for after hours and weekends with staff that can be deployed if an EAD is suspected. Another thing is to maintain good records of livestock movements. That's your NLAS, National Vendor Decks, your Goat Health Declarations, people, visitors, and contracts. And I mean, everyone potentially got sick of QR codes during COVID, but I have a QR code on my front gate. I'm in a trial for a QR code to record visitors that come on and off the property. And it's a little app, and they can answer what properties they've been onto that day, where have they been in the last, have they been overseas within a certain time period, and it does a risk assessment on, depending on what you put in, as to whether they're allowed onto the property or not. Where do you buy your feed? Where is it produced? Have you got a commodity vendor deck for it if the hay has been produced somewhere else? And vehicles. And ensure your property identification code details are up to date. Anyone with livestock, even if it's a single pet goat, is required to have a property identification code. And that information is land and livestock details, your contact details as in postal, email, and your phone. In some states, there's an annual requirement to verify your details that are linked with this PIC. In others, it may be every 3 years. But in most, if there's a change in your land or your contact details, there's a 28-day requirement to notify these changes to your state agricultural department. It's like when you move house with your driver's license, you're required to update it within a certain time period. Basic farm biosecurity, ensuring you've got clean boots, workwear, vehicles. Have you got an area where you can, if you've got visitors on who've been out with your livestock, is there an area where they can wash down their boots before they leave? Have you got a biosecurity kit in your car or your house, like a bucket with disinfectant, scrubbing gear and boots or gloves? You can control the border at your fence line because that's your property. You can control what can come in and out of your property. So basically it's coming clean and going clean. Work out where you want vehicles to park so that your goats don't have contact with them. And any weed seeds that might be in the treads or the undercarriage fall in the areas that goats don't graze. Thing is, with your vet, let them know if you're organic. Some chemicals and disinfectants that we're required to clean and soak our footwear and equipment in so that we don't spread diseases cannot just be tipped anywhere, because we also don't want to void your organic classification. I know I've got places where I go that I use the disinfectant, but I take the disinfectant away with me because that particular property is classified as organic and I don't want to risk their organic status. Whenever you're purchasing goats, ask for a health declaration. Some of you, if you're in a number of online social media goat groups, will have seen the little pictograph. Animal Health Australia kindly made it into a pictograph, and because when I used to give talks years ago, I used to say a PIC is like a driver's license, NLS tags are the number plates on your car, the MVD is the car registration papers, and a National Goat Health Declaration is the mechanic's report. Buying goats, they are going to be a long-term commitment for you. And for some people, they're a commitment longer than even their first car. You might have them for up to 10 to 12 to 15 years or more. So you really want to make sure when you're buying something that it is good quality that's going to last and isn't going to bring something onto your property or be a lemon, as in some cars that you can sometimes get are. Transporting your goats. When you're transporting goats for sale or anything else like that, they have to be fit to load. MLA has a really good resource that you can get from the MLA website or download as a hard copy. Basically, fit to load is you've got to be able to wear bare weight on all legs, free from disease, injury or distress, strong enough and in fit condition to travel, and there are legal what's the word? There are time frames on how long off water, not being too heavily pregnant, and will they travel, load and walk without impairment or distress. Then they're fit to load. But if your goat is ill and non-weight bearing, you are allowed to take your goat to the vet. However, in some states, it's not more than 50 kilometres from your property unless you've got a vet certificate. So make sure your vet knows that you're coming just in case you're unfortunately waylaid by the police. But you can't transport the goats in the boot, and they can't be transported within the passenger section. If your vet cannot come to your property, consider, do you have the means to transport the goat safely to the vet? If your goat has a zoonotic disease, what precautions are you going to take to not transmit it to other people or animals? If your goat has a notifiable disease, what precautions are you going to take to not transmit them to other animals or contaminate the vet clinic? If you're taking your goat to the vet clinic, the vet also has the requirements to do a citing function on the NLS database. So please make sure that your vet knows your property identification code, especially if samples are going to be submitted for testing, as they will need those details for the lab paperwork. And when you are transporting goats, also consider whether the does are pregnant and whether they'll be stressed by the transportation, as they may unfortunately slip or abort the fetuses if they become too stressed. Now, this covers paperwork. Anything that you give an animal, livestock, you need to record it within 48 hours of using the veterinary chemical product and keep it for 2 years from the date of use. If you have used any products on your goat, let your vet know, as some may react adversely with what they wish to prescribe for your goat. If you've used any washers, backliners, pour-ons or powders externally on your goat, let your vet know. As with some of these chemicals, there are rehandling withholding periods, and your vet does not want to have an allergic reaction whilst handling your goat. You may not have had a reaction when applying the product, but others may have a sensitivity to the product, even to products seen as natural. With veterinary chemicals, when you use them, you've got to record what you use, the species, location, description of the animal, the date when they were treated, quantity of the product used. You've also got to record the product's expiry date, batch number, withholding period and export slaughter interval, and the date it's safe to slaughter or consume any milk products. If you use a veterinary chemical not registered for goats, or a veterinary chemical at a different dose rate to that on the label, you need an off-label advice note from your private vet. The best thing is to develop a relationship with your private vet so that they know you, your setup and your goats, as invariably animal health emergencies happen after hours. If you're regularly using off-label products in your goats, developing an on-farm animal health program in consultation with your private vet is an ideal. So what are we trying to avoid? We're trying to avoid Johne's disease, CAE, foot rot, lice, scabby mouth, noxious weeds, notifiable diseases, resistant internal parasites, and zoonotic diseases. These are things that you should be able to prevent from coming onto your property. Now, depending on where you are in the country, you may or may not think Johne's disease is a problem in your area. I just saw a media article the other day that certain areas of New South Wales, they now see Johne's disease as being endemic in the sheep industry areas. Johne's disease is caused by a bacteria that's spread by feces. Basically, it causes thickening of the intestinal lining so that the animal can't absorb its own food, and so it starts to utilise its fat and muscle reserves. It's also known as a chronic wasting disease. As Beck mentioned earlier, goats can get both the sheep and cattle strains of Johne's disease, and there's no known cure. There is a vaccine that over time, with other management practices, will reduce the bacterial load on your property, but in the long run, it's better not to have the disease in your livestock. Johne's disease is production limiting with welfare issues in the long run. And the photo in the top corner, sorry, I should have said before that there may be some upsetting photos in this presentation, but that shows an example of Johne's disease in the British Alpine with real enlargement of the lymph nodes, and there was thickening of the intestines as well. CAE, known as caprine arthritis encephalitis, is a small ruminant lentivirus that's spread mainly by colostrum milk and saliva. It can cause arthritis, mastitis, pneumonia, and encephalomyelitis in kids. There's no known cure, but with hygienic management and testing and culling of positive goats, the disease can be controlled, managed, and eradicated from the herd. Unfortunately, this disease is only notifiable in Victoria. So for those in other states, please definitely ask the questions and make sure you get a fully completed goat health declaration that covers both Johne's disease and CAE. With goats, with lice, there's two main types of lice seen in goats in Australia. A rounded-headed chewing lice that causes goats to itch and rub against the trees, fences, and other structures. And then a pointy-headed blood-sucking louse, which causes anemia and ill thrift. You can basically tell the difference between them by their head shape, how active they are when exposed to sunlight, and if you squish one between your fingernails and get blood, that will most likely be the blood-sucking louse. There was a Paraboss webinar on lice today that had some really useful information regarding goats. But with goats, there are only two products registered, diazinon, which has risks for the user, and pestine, which cannot be used in lactating goats. So most producers get permission from their vet to use an off-label product, but it's best to use a product that doesn't also affect the internal parasites, as a second treatment is required 10 to 14 days after the first treatment to get the nymphs that have hatched from laid eggs. Fecal egg counts and larval differentials are vital to understanding the worm population in your goats on your property. Understanding their life cycles and how to use paddock rotations and temperatures to reduce larval loads is essential to a worm control program. If you do need to drench, it is also essential to do a post-drench fecal egg counts 10 to 14 days after the drench to check that the drench you used was actually effective. Now, Paraboss website has some really good information. They have a suite of tools with Worm Boss, Lice Boss, and Fly Boss. For off-label drenching in goats, basically, you need to get the advice in writing from your vet. And if your vet's not sure on what dosage to prescribe, they can actually get information from Paraboss. They can email Paraboss with their veterinary registration number, and there is a webinar and a management guide that they can access to be able to get that information. What I'm showing there is a young bull goat that has got the swelling underneath the jaw, and what we're looking at there is FOMACHA, which is a way of assessing the level of anemia in goats. And small hobby producers can use that to look at the anemia. So with the animals with a score of 1, they've got a real pink-red eye mucus membrane colour and don't require treatment for Barber's poleworm. whereas goats with a score of 5 have a white mucous membrane and they require immediate treatment and probably intensive or palliative medical treatment. Unfortunately, this goat actually died. The producer did not realise that they had a problem with Barber's poleworm. With properties whose worm population is developing drench resistant, there are still a number of options you can use. Bioworm, which is a natural fungus that when fed daily, the goats passes through the intestines and germinates in the manure. Then it traps, paralyzes and consumes the emerging worm larvae. It is very expensive for a larger herd, but you can target feed high risk risks of goat, high risk goat groups, which is an option. With smaller herds that are being fed daily, it's a great tool in breaking the worm parasite's life cycle. Please don't be offended if your vet asks you to wear a mask and gloves, and please do so. They don't want you to contract a disease from your animals, because zoonotic diseases may not have been on your radar, but the vet might come out and think there's potentially something with your goat that makes it a potential for you yourself to get sick. I know many years ago when I was doing my veterinary degree as a vet student, I was vaccinated against Q fever, and then my employer, for anyone who goes out in the field, we have to be vaccinated against Q fever to work with livestock. But salmonella, scabby mouth, these are diseases which you can actually pick up from your own livestock if you're not careful and don't wash and decontaminate your hands properly. Everyone's mentioned 30 days for quarantine. Basically, the 30 days is so you can test for the diseases that you want, and I should now include mycoplasma in there, and to get the results back before these animals actually go out on your pasture, to be able to test, treat for worms, and then retest to make sure that the drench that you actually used did work. Check for external parasites and give 2 treatments for lice if they're needed. Trim the toes and check for foot rot. Allow weed seeds to pass through the intestinal tract and checking the coats for weed seeds. I can remember years ago, I had a cattle producer who was sending cattle out on adjustment during one of the droughts. And I said, well, when you come back, make sure you cut off the brush of the tail and quarantine them. Cattle came back looking beautiful and good health. But about 6 months later, he rang me up and said, look, I forgot to do what you told me to do. And I said, what was that? And he said, I didn't check the brush of the tail. Now I've got Ngura burr all over the farm. So weed seeds, you can bring in weed seeds that will increase your bill over the next couple of years to get rid of them. And it gives you time to vaccinate against Clostridioides, cheesy gland if you're in a sheep intensive area, and Johne's disease if your property is at risk or you've got areas at risk in your area. And it also gives times for the animals to adjust to you, your feed, and your climate. So how do issues enter a property? By purchasing goats, by goats returning from shows, agistment, or drive-by matings. You can get weed seeds within your feed, chemical residues within your feed. Sometimes in manufactured feeds, there can be mineral imbalances, which can cause issues. Water, runoff from your neighbours, creeks. Floods are notorious for bringing in diseases in the silt and weed seeds that were a long way away and hadn't been seen on your property before. I know with my own little place here, I fortunately didn't get flooded, but I got my annual rainfall in 1 month last year when I don't normally get rain, and there have been so many weed seeds and plants that have germinated that I haven't seen on my property before because we never had rain at that particular time. So rain at an unusual time can germinate weed seeds that you didn't know you had on your place. Wind with aerosol spread. I know there have been a few goat producers over the years that have had issues with neighbours who have used feces from abattoirs to fertilise their pastures, that have brought issues onto their own farm, or treated effluent that has brought issues on their farms. Vehicles, transport trucks coming on, contractors, services, the people, visitors, family, friends, and ones that you don't even know have come to visit. If you share equipment like your trailers or your drench guns, vaccinators or foot parers, making sure that they are disinfected between use, or trailers are washed out. I know whenever I take animals to the abattoirs, I always use the pressure cleaner at the abattoir to clean the trailer out before returning it to the friends that I've borrowed it from. Stray livestock. I, unfortunately, over the years, I know twice I have had goats dumped on my place, and both times they brought in lice, which I was not very happy about. But that's the thing, working out, making sure that stray livestock can't normally get onto your place. Prior land use. I've had producers who have, unfortunately, been diagnosed with the disease, and it took 10 to 12 years for the disease to build up before it actually exhibited in their own animals. With some diseases, it can take that long. You yourself, you go and help a friend with their animals. Do you make sure that you change your boots and your clothing before you come and look at your own animals at home? So the big thing is, biosecurity is about controlling what comes onto and what leaves your property. It basically comes down to good management, good husbandry, and vigilance to protect your livestock and your land assets. Everyone's got a role to play, no matter what size their farm is, their type of stock, or how many. And the photos on the screen are an example of why we talk about biosecurity and why we don't want certain diseases in Australia. This is actually foot and mouth disease in goats in Nepal, and you can see the blistering on the tongues and the edges of the mouth. It sounds big and scary, but a lot of the time it's simple little things that you are probably already doing. And it's just tweaking them, writing them down, putting them in a plan, letting your family members know, letting any of the workers who work for you know that you've got this plan. And as other people have said before, reviewing it annually or whenever there is any change, especially when there's any change in your neighbours or things like that, because your neighbour may not be someone who grew up in the country or has much knowledge about livestock, and you can always help and educate others on what's important to protect you, your livestock, and your industry.
Great. Thank you very much, Berin, for your both vet and producer perspective on biosecurity and what it means both for the vets, for producers, working closely with vets, and then also some really practical take-home summary points about biosecurity, and really reinforcing that a lot of producers probably are already doing a lot of these practices. So that ends tonight's webinar, but just before we go, we will do a really quick Q&A session. For those participants still on the session, please do jump onto the MLA Goats Hub website. Information's available on the screen at the moment to get some additional resources in relation to the Goat Health Disease Guide, which spells out a lot of the diseases that were discussed tonight, as well as subscribing to the Goats quarterly Goats on the Move newsletter, where we do up-to-date information on all things going on in the goat industry, including updates to AHA resources, integrity systems webinars, and all things goat related. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar. We will appreciate your feedback from today's session to help guide and inform future MLA Goat webinar topics. So please click the link in the chat box to complete a really quick survey. But just before we go, we do have just a little bit of time to ask each of the speakers tonight, because I think all of the questions have been addressed in the Q&A, just what their top tip for producers listening is regarding goat biosecurity, and what their tip is for those producers. So we might just go in order of speaker. So Elizabeth, what is your top tip for those producers on tonight's webinar?
If you're not sure, ask for help. There's loads of resources and people out in industry and government that are willing and able to help you with biosecurity. So never be afraid to ask if you're stuck or don't understand something. And I don't know. The other two top tips aren't really specifically on farm, but just be aware of your requirements, I guess, around traceability. It's really important and critical. And again, if you need help, make sure you reach out to us so you can get your NLS requirements quite right, because that tracing is really, really important. So it's probably my two top tips there, Melanie.
Wonderful. Thanks, Elizabeth. Rob, we might jump over to you. What are your top tips for tonight regarding biosecurity for the goat industry?
Thanks, Melanie. I'd concur with Elizabeth. They were good tips. Yeah, I guess for those producers out there maybe who haven't implemented a biosecurity plan for their property, definitely recommend getting in there and doing it. As Elizabeth said, there's a lot of resources out there, lots of information to help you sort of do that process. Introductions of animals. You heard that multiple times today. Wise buying could save you a lot of heartache down the track. And final one. Look, I just think get that plan in place and act on it. Don't just put it in the desk drawer. It's meant to be a living document.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Some good take-home tips there. Beck, you're up next. What are your take-home tips for tonight?
Find your local animal health staff and use them to your advantage. It's their job and they generally really like what they do. So if they're anything like me, they'll give you lots of free advice and tell you about all sorts of things that you may not be aware of that you can use in government programs that can benefit your property. It's not just about following the laws of each state. Develop a relationship with your vet instead of online searches and chat groups. Vets are worth their weight in gold. I'm happy to pay my vet whatever they ask. I think the private vets are really underutilized and such a great resource in our country. And I think they really are something that we should be really proud of and support them and support their businesses, especially in small and remote areas and small towns, and ask questions. A number of times a 5-minute phone call to myself as an inspector or animal health professional could have avoided a animal disease issue that has lasted months or years. It happens time and again. Ask a quick question. You can save yourself so much bother. So if you're not sure how all this works, just pick up the phone. That's what we are all here for.
Yeah, great advice there, Beck. Glenda, what are your take-home biosecurity tips for those producers listening today?
Keep networking and just make sure, just keep each other informed as to what's happening and let's build this industry into a really good industry.
Great. Thanks, Glenda. And lucky last, Berin.
Basically, the only stupid question is the one that you don't ask. Ask questions. I know when I first moved to Victoria, what year was that? That was in 2005. My first lot of goats, and this is some of them behind me. I got told by the producer I was buying for them that I was a normal goat owner. And I said that this was pre the goat health declaration. And I said, what do you mean? And She said, everybody just wants to know the price. You've asked me what they were drenched with, when, what with, what they were vaccinated, when they're due to kid. And this is actually pre-NLAS occurring in Victoria. I wanted to I put a numbered tag in each of their ears so I could tell each one from each other. Cultivate a relationship with your vet. You may think your vet doesn't know much about goats, but they've got a whole network that they can access. And there are some really good programs out there that your vet can actually do. Unfortunately, one of them has just finished in May, a goat medicine time online course, which is really good and has a lot of good information that your vet can learn. But there's other avenues that your vet can learn things about goats from other vets, from industry leaders. Give them an opportunity to learn.
There's some really good take-home points. So thank you to all of our speakers tonight on this MLA Goat Roadshow webinar on farm biosecurity. To all those who are viewing this, we will send through links and contact details from all of the speakers who presented tonight, as well as some links to some really useful resources relating to biosecurity and on-farm health that was talked about. So please stay tuned for the email that will be coming out to you shortly with the webinar recording as well. So thank you very much for everyone attending tonight, and hope to see you all soon. Don't forget to click on the link in the chat box as well to fill out the post survey. We'd love to hear what your thoughts are regarding the Goat Roadshow and upcoming topics as well. Thank you very much. Baron.